Hello, and welcome to another Beyond Sunday podcast. This is the parenting edition. I'm here with Dr. Tim Riley and something we're calling the Broccoli series. This is based off of his book, First the Broccoli, Then the Ice Cream. We are on session number 4 today. So if you're like just jumping into this, go back and listen to sessions 1, 2, and 3 because it's all going to build off of itself. And then by the time you get to 4 is going to make a whole lot more sense. Dr. Tim Riley, thank you for joining us again. For the listener out there, tell them a little bit about yourself, your credentials. Why should we listen to you?
Currently, I'm in private practice in Lincoln. I've been in private practice for more than 20 years at this point. Prior to that, I was on the faculty professor of pediatrics at the medical center, the University of Nebraska Medical Center at Monroe-Meyer Institute for Genetics and Rehabilitation. So my training is in primarily pediatric psychology. I've branched out a little bit since then, but I know some stuff about kids.
Yeah, and if you've listened to sessions 1, 2, and 3, and even going back further than that, Dr. Tim was with us on a couple other one-off sessions, one about returning from the pandemic, one about the growing LGBTQ movement and how to parent with that. And so it's been awesome learning with you. And this is session 4. In session 3, we got into the really, truly useful principles for parenting. We talked about principle number 1. Let me go back in my notes and find this. Because principle number 1 and 2, they work together. But 1 is that most behavior is learned behavior. And 2, that behavior has a purpose. Our main takeaway was that give your attention to what you want your kids to do again. So if they are doing positive behaviors, to really support them, appreciate them, cheer them on in those, and then give more attention to positive than to negative behaviors, which leads us to the really, truly useful principle number 3, that children learn from what happens to them.
Yeah. So the anecdote I tend to think of here is like, and I think I saw this on a school playground in Lincoln or somewhere. So it's like this. It was a teacher or a mom talking to this little kid. We'll call her Chloe. Maybe 5 years old, and she appropriately, bent over, looking Chloe in the eyes, and saying, "Now, Chloe, you understand why you can't act like that. You can't be taking kids' toys, balls away from them on the playground. No one is going to want to play with you. They're not going to want to be around you. You're never going to get into a good college. Graduate school is out of good." So that's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but something like that, right? She's really giving her a lecture about this. And then she says, "Now, do you understand me?" and of course, Chloe nods solemnly, "Yes, I understand you." What Chloe really understood was, if I nod solemnly, Mom will stop talking to me. So like in our previous episode, we talked about Josh, the kid downstairs watching TV. This is another example of Mom teaching something entirely different than what she thought she was teaching. Mm-hmm. She thought she was teaching Chloe these important life lessons. What she was teaching her was, it's best not to be completely honest about this. And if I just do this behavior, I nod and look solemn and say, "Yes, I understand," I get to go play again. And I'm constantly amazed by parents who seem to think that kids have more insight into their own behavior than their parents do.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's kind of just a slice of what it's like to parent right now, because there's a lot of different advice that we receive as parents, and that's what makes us really murky. That's also what made us want to start a parenting series for you all, is that we have a lot of voices. Which ones can we trust? And we hope that this is one of the voices that you can trust. But one of the voices that I've heard as a parent of a 5, 7, and 9-year-old currently is like, talk to your kids about these hard things. Talk to your kids, like if they don't know about the pandemic, talk to them about the pandemic. If they don't know about LGBTQ, talk to them about that. If they don't know about racial justice. Talk to them about that. And you're saying like some of these things are going to be pretty big. Don't just bring them up because you want them to learn about it.
Yeah, because it makes you feel better
Yes.
somehow. I mean, I don't think there's reason to introduce difficult topics into kids' lives unless you have to. I mean, you get X number of years to be a kid.
Yeah.
And to develop some really important kind of skills and ideas and all of that. And you don't need that to be mucked up with, adults putting adult concepts on top of you, particularly those that you really don't understand.
Right.
Right. And then you get more of that like head nodding behavior.
Goodness gracious.
And the other thing that parents are inclined to do is they'll ask kids why they did something.
Right.
Why did you do that? Why did you hit your brother? And as often as not, the answer is, I felt like it.
Right.
Because I wanted to. But if they say, I wanted to, then the parent's like, no, that's not it. There has to be something more to it. And so the kid will go to work trying to figure out some explanation that will satisfy the parent, get them off their back. That's the equivalent of nodding their head solemnly. And then what they're really learning is, my parent is really not interested at all in the reason for this, and it's best if I lie to them if I want to get back to doing what I need to do. Telling the truth doesn't get me anywhere because they'll just keep questioning me.
Wow. And one thing that I learned is that even complex things, what I want my kid to learn from it is, and this is what you're talking about, is they're coming at it with the mind of a kid.
Yeah.
And so an example of this for me was years ago in Omaha, there was a shooting that happened. And because of that, like a lot of Omaha shut down. Mm-hmm. This was during shortly after the George Floyd, and there was a lot of tension in the city. And I remember my oldest son at that time was a preschool student here, and we, like a lot of the city, actually closed early and said, stay in your homes, yada, yada, yada. So my son Benton, he was with me at the door, smiling and waving to parents as they like frantically came in early to pick up their kids. So then on the way home, Benton's like, what is going on? Like, this is different. What is like, and I heard someone mention a shooting, and I'm like, oh, goodness gracious. What do I say to my kid? So I was like, well, I tried to explain it to him. Well, these two grownups, like one was being mean and the other one was being mean, and they got in a fight and a tussle, and one of them shot, and was it an accident? I don't know, buddy, if it was an accident or not. But one of the men died, and people are or could be really upset about that. And when I got all done, his response, and this was from a 5-year-old brain at the time, was, so they were both mean to each other.
Yeah.
And that was an aha moment for me, was like, oh, yeah, that's correct. And his takeaway, he was understanding it from a 5-year-old, where I kind of wanted him to understand, like, there's racial tension in the city.
Yeah.
And that just wasn't
and after
going
we're
to
done
happen.
talking about that, Benton, let's spend a few minutes talking about organic chemistry.
Right. To speak Russian again.
Yeah, he's not equipped to deal with those things. And we talked about this before, not answering questions that aren't being asked.
Right.
It's just like you give a brief answer, more than likely it's going to be satisfactory, and they're like, okay, what's for lunch? And go on from there. I mean, his understanding of shooting is not an adult understanding. It's, what he sees in, Marvel movies or whatever. And so you don't need to elaborate on things that are outside of his reasoning ability at that point. It's just confusing.
Right. So in your book, you talk about gravity.
Yeah.
And this is one of my favorite, and I'm keeping up as far as I can to do this podcast, but this has been one of my favorite images, pictures of an analogy with parenting, and you talk about gravity, that it is the best teacher ever. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think gravity is I don't know when I started thinking about this, but gravity is a model for how you, in particular, you develop corrective training to your kids or discipline for your kids. And that is you want to try to be like gravity, because gravity is a tremendous teacher. And it's a tremendous teacher for a variety of reasons. One is it is 100% reliable. If you jump off of the King of Kings building 10 times, you will fall down 10 times. You'll never fall sideways, never up. You will always accelerate at 32 feet per second, never changes. These are immutable laws of the universe. Gravity doesn't get mad at you. It doesn't yell at you. It doesn't get angry. It doesn't give second chances. It just happens. And because of that, kids accept it, and they just change their behavior accordingly. I have never met anyone who said, yeah, I saw my kid outside, shaking their fist at gravity, saying, quit pulling me down. I hate it when you do that. They don't do that. They just accept it. This is the way the world works. I need to adjust. I need to not jump off of tall things. And by the way, if I take maybe 3-month-old kid up on the top of this building and put him to the edge, they're as likely to crawl off the edge or roll off the edge as not. But some number of months later, they stop doing that. They'll go up to the edge and then back away from it. How do they learn that? They don't learn that because you teach them the laws of physics. They don't learn that because you give them a lecture about now you need to not jump off of tall things. Mm-hmm. They learn from their experience. They learn from what happens to them. And gravity is just a really nice example of how that learning process takes place. It's their experience, not their knowledge about how fast they accelerate, jumping off of buildings that makes them change.
So really, truly useful principle number 3, children learn from what happens to them. Parents, be like gravity. If we can be, the more consistent we can be, gravity doesn't give a warning. It doesn't say, hey, you do that again, you'll fall next time. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's consistent. It happens every time. It doesn't give second chances. And if we as parents can be more consistent like that, like you break the rule and we're going to give this consequence, we're also not going to be emotional about it.
I'm just a force of nature here.
Yeah, you are.
I don't get angry with you. I'm not upset with you. I'm not going to yell at you about this, but something is going to happen if you behave in ways that I disapprove of. And also something is going to happen if you behave in ways that I approve of.
Yeah.
I'm going to notice those as well. That's how I'm going to help you make the distinction in your life between what appropriate behavior is, what productive behavior is, and what unproductive behavior is.
And then another incredible side effect of this is, I believe it was the amazing Bruce Lee who said, be like water. So be like gravity. You can feel a little bit like Bruce Lee, which is awesome.
Okay. What's
another
be
force
like
of
water
nature?
Is what?
You don't have to connect it all, Tim. That's fine.
Okay.
Someone out there connected to that. Be like gravity. That brings us to our really, truly useful principle number 4, the learning process.
Yeah.
And now in your book, for all of you, you're going to rush out when the second edition comes out sometime this summer or early fall of First of Broccoli and the Ice Cream.
Maybe next spring.
Or next spring or 2025, whenever Dr. Tim's able to wrap this up. You're going to rush out, you're going to buy this book, and when you get to this section of the book, it's going to look like your nightmares of math from high school. Because there's some equations in this, and we're going to try to unpack these in ways that are easy to understand. But really, truly useful principle number 4, the learning process.
Yeah, so if you're able, this would be a good time to grab a piece of paper and a writing utensil.
If you're driving, don't do it.
Yeah.
But you'll turn back to whatever minute marker you're on now at home. Grab your pencil, grab your paper. Go ahead.
This is just a good way to illustrate some really, really important ideas. It really kind of brings together everything that we talked about, how learning happens, right? So think, for example, about what happens if you do jump off a building or you don't jump off a building. There's a very big difference in those outcomes, right? And so people learn things very quickly. You don't have to fall out of the tree too many times to realize that it's a good idea to hang on when you're in a tree. And what we want to do then is apply those ideas in a systematic way as we're thinking about, well, what do we want to teach? How do we go about teaching it? So when kids are little, we make most of the choices for them. We can make them do things that we want them to do, although I've known any number of parents of 2-year-olds who don't seem to be able to get them to do anything. For the most part, if you want to take their little hand in yours, you can and get them to do something, but they get older, they get more active, they spend more time away from us. So then how do we translate that? And we translate that into finding ways to make it obvious to them what's a good choice and what's a bad choice. And those are the principles that we're talking about here. So, when kids are little, they might be motivated by an extra cookie or a few minutes more outside. When they're older, it's like, the car keys or whatever. But the principles are the same.
Hey, Tim, what would motivate you more right now? An extra cookie or car keys?
50, yeah.
50-50? I'm going with the cookie every time. But anyway, keep it going.
So the way that I illustrate this is, and if you're able to write this down, if not, then visualize it. A big letter C, and then an X for times.
Okay.
A big letter R, and then either an arrow pointing to the right or equal sign, and then a little triangle. And that triangle that's a symbol, science-y symbol for change. And in this case, the change is learning. So what this equation says is that contrast, C, times repetition creates learning, creates improved behavior, creates change in a positive direction.
Okay, so I contrast C, which I need to learn what that means, times repetition, you said?
Yep.
Equals a learned behavior.
Right.
Okay.
A change in behavior, which is
change.
what learning is, or at least how we're able to demonstrate that learning has happened.
Got it. So tell me about contrast.
Okay, so by contrast, what we mean is that something different happens to the kid depending on what their behavior is. So what we want is for good behaviors, or what we define as good behaviors, which is behavior that's going to help the kid develop the skills that they need to be successful in their life. Good behaviors produce good outcomes. If I do something that's appropriate, adaptive, productive, good things happen for me. I get the extra cookie. I get the car keys. I get the whatever. If I don't do that thing, none of that happens. And maybe something unpleasant happens on top of it. The bigger the difference is in those two situations, the better the good things and the worse the bad things, the quicker learning happens.
Yeah, you mentioned in one of our earlier podcasts about, like, if a child does something you don't want them to do, you want it to appear the vast difference between like a vibrant, colorful, incredible image, almost thinking like the Wizard of Oz when they finally get to the land of Oz and it's beautiful and colors like they'd never seen before, versus black and white, dull, drear. It needs to be a whole different world. Sorry, Kansasites. Kansasians. No, not Kansasians. That's even worse. I'm going to stop. Kansans? I didn't stop.
Let's go, okay. Kansans.
So that contrast, making it wildly different for that child.
Yeah, and so last time you talked about your daughter wanting to go outside.
Yes.
Remy.
Yes.
Yeah, or Bemi.
Remy.
And so what you said was, don't go out there.
Right.
And she went out there.
Yep.
And your reaction initially was nothing.
Yeah.
So what changed for her because she didn't listen to you? Nothing.
Nothing.
So
No contrast.
that means no contrast.
Right.
And so if you look at that equation and you put a 0 in the place of the C, 0 times anything is 0. She may have learned something there, but she didn't learn anything like what you wanted to learn
Right.
about how to listen to you because of the lack of contrasting outcomes. For her, there was no effect on her life. What we want is for kids to be able to notice a change in what their life is like if they do or do not follow through with things that we ask them for.
Right.
So once you decided that, okay, there's not going to be any dessert tonight, and then you followed through with that, you introduced a meaningful change in her environment. Then it's up to her to decide whether or not it matters, whether I might still be willing to give up dessert if I can play outside for another 15 minutes, but you at least made the choice apparent to her. The bigger that difference is, the better in terms of being able to learn.
So you talk about it's a parent's job to make life as fun and interesting and enjoyable as possible when the child is doing well.
Right.
And as dull, boring, and uninteresting as possible when they are not. Let me give you another scenario. This is with Bemmy, little Remy Cube. Now, Remy Cube at times, it's interesting. We don't even necessarily, we haven't been able to compute when and why this happens. Sometimes she walks into school as happy as can be, and sometimes she'll fight it with every ounce in her little body. Mm-hmm. And it's a tricky thing. It's a helpless feeling as a parent when she's having one of those days where she just doesn't want to let you leave, and you drop her off at school and she's clutching onto your hand and you're like trying to get out the door and she's screaming bloody murder, and you like finally a teacher comes and holds on to her and you get out that door and you rush to your vehicle and you feel like a failure as a parent. And so in a time like that, my go-to is like, I'm going to have a big talk with Remy later. And I don't know that that's ever been effective for me. But I don't know in this discussion right now, what could that contrast look like?
Well, it might.
It's a tricky one. It's a stumper.
No, it really isn't.
Oh, shoot.
The other thing to keep in mind here is that it takes some number of repetitions, which is the other thing that we're going to talk about.
Okay, the other part of the equation.
For a kid to learn something, right? There are very, very few things in life that are learned in one trial. Like, putting your hand on a hot burner on the stove once is probably enough.
Yep, that'll do it.
Calling a large unruly person bad names probably is one that you learn fairly quickly not to do. But most things take a little practice, and particularly if, as it sounds like, she might have a little bit of anxiety about the whole school kind of thing.
Yeah, some days.
So in that particular case, you actually want the contrast to be in the direction of what it's like when she goes in voluntarily, and then it produces a big outcome about how proud you are of her, what a great job she did when she comes home.
Right.
At the time that you're dropping her off, you want it to be as gravity-like as you possibly can.
Consistent.
Yep.
No warnings.
This is what we do every day.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, I can see you're unhappy. Bye. See you later.
So don't play into her anxiousness in that moment.
Right, because what you're doing fundamentally is giving attention to that anxious behavior, which we identified as maybe the most powerful positive reinforcer of it all for little kids. And if you end up attending to it, then you're encouraging that behavior, as opposed to the sooner you get out of there, the better in that particular situation.
So you give 3 different examples of parents. One is indulgent parents. So when I am like, one more hug, and it's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. I'm indulging her in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, there's no, whatever contrast there is in that moment is in the wrong direction.
Right.
It's in the direction of the more you complain,
the more attention I give
the
you.
more I respond.
Yeah.
right? So again, you're teaching her something, but it's not what you believe you're teaching her. You're probably reacting more to your own discomfort in that situation
Right.
than to hers, honestly.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
It really is. So there are three different types of parents that you mentioned.
Yep.
These, the distracted or disinterested parent. What does that look like?
Those are the parents for whom kids are almost kind of an inconvenience, right? They're more involved in their own lives than they are in the kids' lives, which is there's some justification to that to some point, but they like basically don't pay a lot of attention to the kids regardless.
Yeah.
So that means that the kids get away with a lot of misbehavior because their parents aren't really watching what's going on.
Is there a rise in this type of parenting with smart devices?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't have any research data to support that, but that's my impression. That's what I hear from kids is, mom's on her phone all the time. Mm-hmm. She's on the couch, we're doing stuff, and, she's doing Instagram or Facebook or whatever. And so those kids often misbehave in pretty big ways because, I've been doing this behavior for a while. Nothing really happened. Didn't cause any problems for me. So I keep escalating. Nothing's caused me any problems before. No reason to expect that it will now.
Yeah.
And then often when the parents do respond, it's they respond too much, or they say, go to your room. And so the kid goes to their room, and what has really changed for them?
Yeah. Nothing.
Location.
Yeah.
That's it. They were being ignored before. They're still being ignored when they're in their room. There's no contrast in that situation. Those kids aren't going to learn anything. 0 times anything is still 0.
Right. A friend of mine painted this picture for me once about like a distracted parent being like when a kid goes on a carousel. And they come around, and every time that kid's looking for their parent, and they want them to smile at them,
Yep.
wave at them, whatever. With the modern age with smartphones, or even back in the day with newspapers, or just wandering in our own minds, if we don't ever look at that kid, they're going to learn to quit looking at us. So,
And when they quit looking at us, the implication of that is over time, they're going to look to somebody else.
there you go. Okay, then there's the indulgent parent that I mentioned earlier. Tell us a bit about that parent.
Yeah, so that's the parent who is always attentive to the kids. Kids are at the center of the universe. Kids get lots of privileges and attention no matter what, and experience few consequences regardless of what their behavior is. Those are parents who are not satisfied. A couple of sessions ago, we talked about being a good enough parent, meeting kids' needs, but not all of their wants. Those are parents who are not satisfied with that. You use the term helicopter parent or bulldozer parent.
Right.
Those are parents who are overly involved in their kids' lives, managing every detail. And so the kids don't really get as much chance to misbehave because the parents are in the middle of everything doing it, but there's no real contrast in those situations either. And then when they do have to confront something that's more difficult, they have a hard time doing it.
And then you mentioned the rigid parent.
Yeah, so the rigid parent is the strict rules, can't be violated in any way, structure in every aspect of their lives all the time, and must be responsive to everything that the parent says immediately. It's kind of the, boarding school, approach to things. And
right.
What tends to happen, and there need to be some rules. We're going to talk in some detail about how to structure rules and some of those things later on. There need to be rules. There need to be some things that are non-negotiable, but that number's pretty small, honestly. You're making sure that you're taking care of the core things, and then beyond that, you want to begin to involve your kids in the process of being able to negotiate or talk about things or whatever. When kids never get the opportunity for that, when it's just absolute compliance
all the time.
Yes. The most likely reaction is they go underground.
Oh.
They start learning to be sneakier or to bootleg things because there's no good way for them to really get what they want from the parent. There's no flexibility in anything. So they learn other ways to accomplish what they want to accomplish.
So you give these examples of parents. So none of them are great. Like I'm not supposed to pick one of these and be like, I'm one of these. Or do most people fall in one of these buckets of distracted, indulgent, or rigid parenting?
Yeah, I don't think anybody probably falls into all of those. I mean, they're just
Okay.
intended as sort of guidance for things to look out for, right?
Got it. So you have each of us may have a tendency to fall in one of these three categories.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. At least I did. I mean,
So when you see a kid or even an adult, can you make a good guess as to what they're parenting, like how they were parented
yeah.
by their behavior? So
Yeah.
how do you think my parents, were my parents distracted, indulgent, or rigid?
Yes.
Wow. Come on, get off the fence. It hurts sitting on a fence, Tim. What do you think?
I don't know that I know you enough, but I'm inclined to say that they were more rigid.
Yeah, you nailed it. For sure. My parents, they definitely weren't distracted. And not indulgent either. But part of that, I think, is a time piece of it as well. Like for me growing up, the adults most often got the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
So if I came home and I was like, my teacher did this, like my parents never ever took the side of the teacher. It was almost always like, well, what did you do that caused your teacher to do that?
Yeah.
Whereas I have seen the change now where it's like the parent will more often listen to that child and take their side over the teacher pretty quickly. And there's still a lot of you parents out there who are not doing that. But yeah, so I grew up in more of a rigid parenting in that bucket. And I think that's caused me to parent or maybe my inclination is to be more of a rigid parent, or maybe I rebel sometimes and I become more indulgent.
You go in the opposite direction.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But each of us land somewhere in one of these buckets, and it's good for us to kind of acknowledge that, diagnose that, so we know what our tendencies are, but to not be content in any of those three buckets.
Yeah, and what you're really looking for is balance. And I mean, everything that we have talked about, everything we will talk about, is aimed toward being, reasonable in your expectations, but having expectations.
Yes.
Right? Not expecting 4-year-olds to understand or do things that they're not prepared to do yet, but also expecting that, kids are going to comply with you, not only for their own safety. I mean, like, sometimes you just need them to listen to you just because. I mean, if I say, don't stick that fork in the outlet,
Yeah.
I don't want to have a discussion about that. I
Right.
need them to do that. Don't run in the street. That's not open for discussion, right? So there are some things where you need to just be compliant. But once we establish what those kind of core things are, and you've established yourself as an authoritative instead of authoritarian
Yeah.
kind of presence
Yeah.
in their lives, then within that framework, this part we're not going to negotiate about at all. But from there, we can have a talk, and I will listen to you, but at the end of the day, I'll make the decision, and my decision is going to be the one that matters in the end.
And that gets into repetition
Yeah.
of parenting like gravity, be like gravity, parents. That repetition of it being consistent over and over again. You have a story in your book about Jackson and the toy train.
Yeah, this actually was something that happened in a clinic. I think I was doing an outreach clinic in Columbus at the time. And the usual approach is parent comes in with the kid. I usually would talk to the kid for a few minutes to try to get to know them while the parent looks on. And then at some point I said, okay, good, thank you. I need to talk to your mom for a few minutes. Go over there and play for a while, and I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk to you again. And so after a couple of minutes, the kid comes back, and he has this little toy train, and as the wheels go around, the engineer's head bounces up and down. He's, Mom,
nice.
look. And she's like, oh, isn't that so cute? Look at that. Look what happens when you turn the wheels. That's so cute. Thank you for showing me that. Go play now while I talk to the doctor. Fine, right, very nice. Good reaction, positive response. couple minutes later, the kid comes back with a different toy. Says, Mom, look. And she says, would you get away from me? I am talking to the doctor.
Holy cow, Jekyll and Hyde.
Plenty of contrast, right?
Yes, huge C for
Big
contrast.
difference between her reaction to the first event and the second event.
So that's good.
But no repetition.
Oh,
no R, because the way she reacted was to essentially the same behavior. Coming to show Mom something was completely different from one time to the next. So big C, but repetition is 0.
Okay.
And anything times 0 is still 0.
Yeah,
so that kid
that's
wasn't
gonna
learning much.
No change, just it's unsettling. What do I do? And as adults, we experience this too, where we're like, hey, I completed my report on time last time, and the boss was pointing me out in the meeting and said, yeah, Charles actually got the report done on time. Thank you, Charles. None of you other losers got it done, and now this time I got it done, and he doesn't. It's like I don't exist
around here. None of you losers.
None of you losers got it done. That is, if I got my reports done on time, I would find out. No, that's not true. But
So basically, I mean, you think about like if one of your kids is studying state capitals.
yes, here we go.
And you're breaking out the flashcards or whatever, and you're helping your Benton learn state capitals.
All right.
And you say, okay, state capital of Texas is
Austin. Got it. 1 for 1.
All right. Next time, state capital of Texas is Dallas. State capital of Texas is
Houston.
El Paso, Houston,
Ooh, wow.
Kalamazoo,
There's
Omaha.
a Kalamazoo?
Whatever.
We're going out of state lines.
If you give a different answer every time to the same question, it's really hard for anybody to learn anything.
Befuddling.
In essence, you can think of your kids' behavior. They do some behavior, and they're asking you a question. Is this behavior okay with you?
Yeah.
Is this a good thing for me to do or not?
Yes.
You want to give them the same answer every time, right? You don't play games by different rules every time. You don't have a different job description. Well, you kind of do. Every time you show up for work. But if somebody changed the rules on you every single time you do, it would be confusing and difficult and painful.
Right.
And that's basically what you do when you respond to the same behavior 2 different ways, or you respond to it anyway one time and not at all the next time. So that idea of consistency is a really, really big deal. I mean, you've heard people say you should be consistent with your kids. This is why. I mean, that's how you're teaching them.
So this is also communication between the mom and the dad as well, to be consistent, whether you're in the same household or not.
Right.
That consistency really matters. Repetition matters.
So we want kids to get the same message from all of the adults with whom they interact. So, again, that points out the importance of having some kind of a plan for what you do and being intentional about what you're doing with parenting so that you're teaching the same thing the same way from one day to the next, one person to the next, one circumstance to the next.
Right. So if Remy, I say, hey, don't go outside, and now I bring her back inside, but then the next day I just let her go again, then it's inconsistent. My repetition is a 0,
Precisely.
and she's not learning. She's only learning. Yeah, my beat. Who knows?
Yeah.
He might punish me. He might not. It's. I'm going to play the game and see what happens.
So this inconsistency, big consequence one time, not so much, actually produces more misbehavior than if you don't respond at all. So I mean, the best example of this, one with which you have, I assume, limited experience, is slot machines.
Slot machines.
Right?
Okay.
So
I've
slot
seen them.
machines there's a lot of behavioral science that goes into gambling and extracting money from people.
Sure.
Slot machines are set to pay off on what's called a variable schedule of reinforcement, which means it's going to pay off. You just don't know when.
Uh-huh.
And so what that produces is a very high level of behavior, because the faster you pull the handle or press the button or however
You'll
it
get a
works
win
now,
at some point.
you're getting to the payoff sooner, right? So things that pay off sometimes, but not all the time, tend to produce very high, very durable rates of responding. So if you are inconsistent, if you lack repetition, you can actually create more problem behavior, as that mom did with the little kid in the toy train in Columbus, I think.
Wow. So we do have time for a bonus, really, truly useful principle, and that is that doing better leads to feeling
better. Yeah.
Yes. Tell us about that.
Kids who are in environments that make sense to them
Okay.
do better.
Okay.
If they have to work to figure out what your position is on things, if one day it's okay to go outside without asking and the next day it's not, that's confusing. It's not as extreme as the example of the little kid with the toy train, but it's kind of the same thing. I mean, I've been in classrooms where there are 9 different ways for the teacher to get the teacher's attention. You can say the teacher's name. You can stand by her desk. You can pull on her shirt. You can wait quietly. You can stand on your desk. You can whatever. Because there's no clear understanding, no repetition in that, those tend to produce very high levels of problem behavior.
Right.
Kids who know where they stand, and they can go on to doing the next thing, the next important kid thing in their life, instead of having to worry about how the parents are. So that is a more comfortable place to be. And if you think about, adult examples of, things that happen to you that are unpredictable or inconsistent, your car won't start.
Yeah.
Or someone doesn't show up to meet you, or as I did, showed up early for the meeting today and it's kind of confusing, or you get laid off, or something changes in your job on short notice. That's disconcerting. It's difficult to deal with emotionally.
Right.
Same thing is true for kids. If things happen unexpectedly or inconsistently, it's hard for them. But they don't have adult level skills to deal with that, right? So if my car breaks down, I've got some really rudimentary mechanic skills. I can open up the hood and look under there, and then after I fail completely at that, I can use my cell phone to call somebody to come help me, or get a tow, or call AAA, or whatever it is. Kids don't have any of that stuff. What they've got is their behavior.
Yeah.
So they behave, they do something, and see what happens. And if something good happens, they do that again.
Yes.
And if something bad happens, they don't do that again. But if something different happens every time, they basically just get confused. That kid in Columbus was one confused little boy.
Yeah.
And he did some fairly extreme stuff just to try to get some kind of a positive or some kind of a reaction out of his mom, which was mostly being yelled at.
Yeah.
And he had some kind of extreme stuff that he would do. And he did it a lot, not because it produced a good reaction, but because it produced a reliable reaction.
Right.
And that consistency was more important to him.
He was looking for something to stand on, even if that was shaky ground.
Yeah.
So the good news for this is God has made each of you different. And I know there's some parents who will say to me, I'm just not really a kid person. And that might be true. It's like, because God has made each and every one of us different. But amid our uniqueness, each of us can follow these principles to give our kids something reliable to stand on. And so that is with the that sea of contrast of making their life different. When they do something that we appreciate, we let them know, we celebrate it. We actually make a difference there. If they do something that we don't want them to do, we make that look different as well. We go from the land of Oz to the dreary land of Kansas, or insert whatever state you don't like. And then that times repetition to be consistent in that. Give your child steady ground to stand on so that each time they go against this rule, they know what's going to happen. They might still roll the dice and see, like, I still really want to get that cookie, so I'm going to reach for the cookie. But then once they get caught, there's actually, and as a kid who misbehaved a lot, like this stood out to me because
I'm really shocked to hear that.
Yeah, isn't that weird? So, and I have siblings who didn't misbehave a lot, but I misbehaved a lot. But I'd have a teacher who was like really strict, and people would just assume that I didn't like that teacher. Mm-hmm. But the reality was, if I knew what to expect from that teacher,
right,
I liked him.
You knew where you stood.
I knew where I stood with that teacher.
And you probably took it up right up to the very edge.
I absolutely did. But I knew if I cross that, I'm going to get punished, and they're consistent with it.
Yeah.
And so parents, you don't all have to be the wildest, goofiest, most fun parent. Show that contrast and be consistent with it, so that C times R is going to lead to things where your kids, they're going to learn that change, and it's going to become consistent. And we don't have to be the goofiest, the silliest. Be who God made you to be. And your kids, they don't need you to be silly. They need you to be you.
Yeah, silly's okay, and
well, if you are silly, be silly.
The bigger point here is they should have a really good idea of how you're going to respond to a particular behavior because you had a really good idea first. You had thought about it. You know where you stand on things, and you're prepared to respond in a consistent way.
Wonderful. So a couple takeaways from this. I'll name one. You name another. I'm going to go with this equation that I just learned, that contrast times repetition will equal change or learned behavior in my child. And that if I don't have contrast, or I'm totally inconsistent with my reaction, then those are zeros, and my child is going to be unsettled and not learn or change their behavior over time. So that's one main takeaway that I got from this. What's another one you'd want people to have?
The biggest takeaway for me is the more consistent you are as a parent, the more intentional you are as a parent, just like you interacting with that stricter teacher, the more you let kids know where they stand, and then you remind them of that time in, time out, every single time, the better their lives are. They may object to not being able to go outside sometime because they had something else for them, but in terms of their adjustment, in terms of their emotional status, they feel more secure in the world because you're like the rock there. They know they can count on what they're going to get from you.
Yes. And like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson says, can you smell what The Rock is cooking? I'd like to leave you with that today. Hopefully you're cooking something delicious. But regardless of all that, thank you for tuning in. I love learning together. Let's learn how to be the best parent we can be, the way God has made us, so that our children will one day be ready to get out there, love on the world around them, because they've been given a foundation, and they've learned some really healthy ways to self-regulate, to live and love the people around them, and that these boundaries, they're helpful. So thank you for joining with us today. We'll see you next time for session 5 of First of Broccoli. See ya.